My grandfather Vova was a recluse and a heavy drinker. He didn't look for drinking buddies. He'd just buy his booze from the nearest store and head back to his lonely apartment, where he'd spend another day drowning in alcohol, losing track of time and days in a fog of intoxication. He never racked up utility debts, often skipped meals to save money, and his fridge was usually empty. But 2 or 3 bottles on the table, that was a constant in his life. Despite being well into his 70s, he drank like a man half his age. Everyone in the building worried about him, and with good reason. They feared he might die behind closed doors, and no one would notice until the smell gave him away. So, anytime there was a sign of trouble, they called me, his only living relative who still kept in touch. The self-appointed watchwoman, Aunt Nadia, would call me at least twice a week. "Hello," I'd answer, already knowing what was coming. "Hi, Dima. Your granddad isn't answering again." I knocked, but he doesn't hear, she'd say. "Damn, all right. I'm on my way," I'd reply. We lived just a few streets apart, and it took me about 10 minutes to get to him. This had happened so many times before, and every time it turned out he was simply blacked out drunk and asleep. But I couldn't just ignore it. I always had a sinking feeling that one of those visits might be the last. Unlocking his door was never easy on the nerves. "Grandpa, you alive?" I'd call out as I stepped into the smoke-filled apartment, that familiar stale world of an old drunk, yellowed wallpaper, ceilings stained from years of cheap cigarettes, spiderwebs clinging to every corner, piles of old rags everywhere. He was lying on the worn-out carpet in the living room, an unfinished bottle by his side. He mumbled something as he opened his eyes. I breathed a sigh of relief. He was alive. But then he shook his hand and reached out. Something didn't seem right. He didn't just look drunk. I crouched down and looked into his clouded eyes. "Grandpa, can you talk?" That's when the panic hit. Was this a stroke? Was he paralyzed? Would I now be stuck caring for a bedridden man? I called an ambulance. While waiting, I kept trying to get a response out of him, but he barely moved his pale lips and groaned faintly. Eventually, a calm and collected paramedic showed up in a light blue uniform. He took one look at the old man and said, before casually rummaging through his kit. He gave Grandpa a shot, and within seconds his eyes cleared. A few more minutes later, the old man smiled and said, "Ah, that's better. Thanks, Doc. Thought I was a goner." I stood there stunned. I couldn't believe how quickly he bounced back after being completely unresponsive. "Nothing serious," the paramedic explained, closing his bag. Drank on an empty stomach, sugar levels dropped, gave him a glucose shot. He'll be fine. Then he added, almost rhetorically, "You're not planning to change your habits, are you, Vladimir Viktorovich? To what end?" Grandpa was now sitting cross-legged on the floor, eyeing his unfinished bottle. "Let me live how I want, at least in my old age. My wife nagged me my whole life, never let me drink in peace. Now I'm free." I scolded him. "Ever since Grandma died, you've been drinking nonstop. This is out of control." "I've got the right," he grumbled. As I walked the paramedic out, I automatically apologized. He just nodded, clearly used to this routine. He must have revived dozens of alcoholics every shift. Just another day on the job. Grandpa caused a commotion again, scared the neighbors, had me rushing over, and dragged emergency services into it. I muttered. "Who asked you to fuss?" he replied, scratching his stubbled cheek without a care in the world. "Your Theon's buzzing around me." "That's the thanks I get for dragging you back from the brink," I snapped. He waved dismissively. "Oh, stop it. I wasn't at death's door. Just felt a bit dizzy. Too bad, really. Would have been nice to come back and tell you what it's like over there." I went to the kitchen, grabbed a trash bag, and started tossing empty bottles into it. The clinking glass filled the gloomy silence of the smoke-saturated apartment. "We all end up there," he said quietly after a long pause. That reminded me of something. There's this idea, a kind of pact between friends or family. The first one to die sends a message from the afterlife. So I brought it up. "Grandpa, let's make a deal. If you ever kick the bucket, which I doubt you will, send me a sign from the other side, just so I know." "All right," he said right away. "You'll get a sign. Maybe a slap upside the head." "I'm going to buy you something to eat," I told him. "Don't drink any more today." "Buy sausages," he called out. "The cheap kind. Don't waste money on the expensive ones." He was such a cheapskate. He even tried to save my money. An oddball if there ever was one. I knew his time would come eventually. He couldn't keep drinking forever, shut up in that apartment. But it felt like that moment was still far off. Not in the next month or even this year, someday. Then a couple of weeks later, I had a nightmare. Well, not even a full dream, more like a terrifying flash, just a second-long vision. I saw his frightened face, eyes wide, screaming, "Dima! Dima!" His voice was filled with panic and despair. I shot up in bed, heart pounding. The feeling of dread stayed with me. I wanted to go check on him, but he hated unannounced visits. So I waited for the next worried call from the neighbor. But hours passed, and Aunt Nadia didn't call. The longer I waited, the more anxious I got. Eventually, I called her myself. "Hello?" she answered. "Hi, Aunt Nadia," I said awkwardly. "I haven't heard anything about Grandpa lately." "Have you checked on him?" "No," she replied. "When was the last time you saw him?" "I've been so busy, I completely forgot." My stomach sank. I hung up and ran to his street. She was already standing by the building, looking worried. I rushed up to the second floor, heart like a stone, and turned the key in the lock. The apartment reeked of old smoke, but not the kind from a freshly lit cigarette. Inside, everything was eerily still, unnaturally quiet. I walked through the living room, barely feeling the floor beneath me, and froze at the doorway. There he was, lying on his back, mouth open. His skin was the color of ash, lifeless. "So, how is he?" came a voice from behind. Aunt Nadia again. "He's dead," I said, barely believing it myself. "Dead? Really dead?" Her voice changed, full of disbelief, but it was true. My grandfather, who had once seemed indestructible, was gone. What a life he led. Holed up between four walls, not reading, not watching TV, not listening to the radio, just drinking cheap vodka to forget. What could he have been thinking about all those years? Maybe he was just waiting for it all to be over. Later, the medics said he'd been dead for 2 days. Strangely, there was no smell. Well, he was practically pickled, I joked to myself. And it hit me. Exactly 2 days ago, he had appeared in that nightmare. Could his terrified spirit have come to me, just like he promised? When they took the body away, a wave of sadness washed over me. I had never seen that apartment without him in it. It felt impossibly empty. First Grandma was gone, now him. A quiet, inevitable end, as sad as it was expected. "Oh, Vovka drank his whole life away," sighed the neighbor, then asked curiously, "Are you inheriting the apartment?" "I guess I am," I replied, though I hadn't really thought about it before. The realization hit me like a wave, of course. The apartment was now mine. It was much bigger than the cramped studio I used to live in. Somehow, this unexpected benefit dulled the edge of my grief, a strange sort of comfort in mourning. Looking around, I realized the place could use a serious cleaning. All the junk needed to go, and eventually it would need a full renovation. But first, I had to take care of the funeral. It was important to handle everything properly, with respect for my grandfather's memory. I had to run around handling paperwork and arrangements, but at least we didn't have to search for a burial plot. Of course, he'd be laid to rest next to Grandma. 2 days passed in a blur of activity. The day before the burial, I decided to tidy up the place. Not because I planned to move in right away, but because there was no point preserving all the clutter. A space should be clean. The apartment had 2 rooms, a small bedroom with an old bed no one had used since Grandma passed, and a living room with a couch, a rug, and a glass front cabinet full of crystal. The rest of the place was full of junk bottles, bags, rags, worn shoes, and felt boots things ready for the trash. It took me the entire day to pack up the garbage into bags and haul them out. The work was exhausting. When night fell, I switched off the light in the living room. That's when I heard a voice, quiet, raspy, and muffled. It seemed to come not from the room, but through the wall. "He's not even buried yet, and the grandson's already taking over." Another, less clear voice mumbled something in response. It was a chilling murmur, and I leaned closer to the wall behind the cabinet to hear better. The sounds were coming from right there. "Tomorrow's the funeral. He's still in the morgue," one of the voices said. My heart nearly stopped. The grumbling sounded just like Grandpa Vova. And what a strange thing to say. Who but someone dead would say they were still in the morgue? The thought that I might be eavesdropping on a conversation between 2 dead people was terrifying. Could they still be lingering here? The voices stopped. I quickly left the room, turned on the light in the hallway, grabbed my things, and left the apartment as fast as I could. The next morning, the funeral procession arrived at the cemetery gates by 11. A few elderly relatives and neighbors showed up. Only one woman, Aunt Nadia, cried, and she wasn't even related to Grandpa. Most likely, she cried out of ritual, not grief. At old people's funerals, there's rarely loud sobbing. When young people die, it's a tragedy. For the elderly, it's expected. It's just how things are. I think I was the saddest one there. Grandpa and I weren't close, but still, his absence left a void. He had his flaws, but he was a likable man. Before they sealed the coffin, I looked at his face and quietly said, "Goodbye, Grandpa Vova. I hope you're at peace. Thank you for everything." I thought I'd seen enough hints of the afterlife. First, there was the strange dream before his death. Then the whispers in the dark. Signs that were hard to ignore. Skeptics would brush it off as imagination. Maybe I would have too, if not for what happened next. About a week after the funeral, I kept coming by to clean. An hour a day, clearing out the last bits of trash, scrubbing, fixing things. Slowly, I was bringing the place back to life. But it felt too slow, so I dedicated a whole day to the work. I rolled up the old rug, tore out the torn linoleum in the hallway, dismantled the falling apart kitchen cabinets. The whole apartment needed a complete overhaul. I worked late into the night, barely realizing how tired I'd become. My eyes were heavy. This is my place too, I thought. I can sleep here. I went to the smaller bedroom, lay down in my clothes, pulled a blanket over myself, scrolled on my phone for a bit, then drifted off. Sometime later, I woke up to the faint sound of clinking glass. The crystal in the cabinet was rattling, like someone was shaking it gently. The noise was soft, but unmistakable. I wasn't terrified, more a mix of unease and curiosity. Grandpa, is that another one of your signs? All right, I get it. Enough already, I whispered. Then came a loud crash, the unmistakable shatter of glass. Dishes had fallen and smashed on the floor. Behind the wall, I heard footsteps on wood, then what sounded like a door slamming. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just the neighbors. I grabbed a broom, cleared a path, and went to inspect the cabinet. Something about it felt wrong. Something told me to move it. When I did, I saw it. A hole in the wall, large enough to fit a hand through. So that's what was going on. The voices had come through here. The cabinet must have been placed to hide it. But who would hide a hole like that? The idea of someone being on the other side made my skin crawl. I pulled the cabinet further aside and looked closely. The hole was at eye level, but I couldn't see a thing through it, just pitch black. Hello? I called into it. My voice echoed like it had entered a deep, empty chamber. No response, only silence. I turned on my phone flashlight and aimed it inside. On the other side was an empty room with gray, soot-stained walls and a wooden floor. There was an unpainted door and, oddly, no windows at all. Was this even a normal room? Its appearance was deeply unsettling. I squinted, almost pushing my face through the hole, and noticed dirty footprints on the floor. Black, muddy shoe prints. This was getting to be too much. I decided not to stir up trouble in the middle of the night. Better to think it over in the morning. I woke early, took photos of the shattered crystal, swept up the shards, and then photographed the hole. It was odd sunlight streamed through the apartment windows, but the hole remained cloaked in darkness. Even with the flashlight, the beam seemed to fade into a smoky haze, like cigarette smoke. No matter how hard I stared, I couldn't make out anything more than the walls and that door. Just endless shadow. I stepped away from the hole, and something struck me in the back of the head. Cold fingers brushed my neck, scratching lightly with sharp nails. The chilling touch made me shiver. I spun around, and I swear there was a hand. It vanished quickly into the wall, pale, aged, and wearing a familiar watch with a worn leather strap. The same one Grandpa always wore. The one we buried him in. His words came flooding back. All right, I'll give you a sign. Maybe a smack on the head. So, that was it. The sign. Grandpa, was that you? I shouted, but my voice broke. The echo sounded strange, like someone mocking me. Why would a dead man appear in a neighboring apartment? My mind desperately searched for logic. I stormed out to the hallway and knocked on the door across from Grandpa's. No answer. Silence. Just then, Aunt Nadia was coming down the stairs. Dima, what are you doing? She asked, noticing my bewildered face. Trying to talk to the neighbors, I said, attempting to sound casual. Do you know who lives there? No one, she replied with a shrug. Remember old Irina Mikhailovna? She died last year. Had no family. Apartment went to the city, I think. Been empty since. I see, I murmured, glancing around, trying to make sense of everything. There were no other doors on that floor, just this one. What's going on? She asked with interest. I thought someone was knocking on my wall, I said, stomach tight with fear. Must be from upstairs, Aunt Nadia said with a wave. They're always fighting. 15 years trying to divorce. Yeah, probably. I nodded, not about to explain what was really happening. She wouldn't believe me. Don't bother going to them, they never listen, she said, before continuing on her way. I stood there for a moment, then reached for the door frame just in case. Sure enough, there it was. Hidden beneath the wood on the right side, an old, darkened key. It's such an odd habit old folks have, hiding keys right next to the door. But in this case, it worked to my advantage. I glanced up and down the staircase to make sure no one was around, then unlocked the door with a trembling hand. A musty odor immediately hit me. Typical for a place that had been uninhabited for a long time. Bits of ceiling plaster littered the hallway floor, and the mirror across from the door was so dusty, it barely reflected anything at all. I stepped inside and shut the door behind me so the neighbors wouldn't see. Room by room, I peeked around faded wallpaper, ancient furniture, a dusty old TV, and the carpet littered with the tiny corpses of dead flies. Then I found the wall that bordered my apartment. It was solid, completely intact, and contrary to what I'd seen before, this wasn't a strange room with gray walls. It was just an ordinary kitchen. I ran my fingers across the rough surface of the wall, struggling to believe what I was seeing. That spot should have connected directly to my living room, and yet there was no hole. How could that be? That meant the opening I found didn't lead into this neighboring apartment at all. It must have opened into something else entirely. Some kind of dark parallel world, or maybe even the afterlife. What else could possibly explain it? Now, real fear crept in. What I'd experienced wasn't just subtle signs or strange coincidences. It was a direct, unmistakable answer. Or rather, a hit to the back of the head, literally from my grandfather, reaching out from the other side like he'd promised. It seemed impossible. I exited the empty apartment, closed the door, and returned the key to its hidden spot beneath the frame. My heart was racing. The last thing I wanted was to go back to my own place, knowing there might be a literal portal to the afterlife inside. But at the same time, how often does a living person get a chance to peer beyond that final threshold? This might be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to see what lies past the veil. I had to go back. I needed to know. Outside, the sun slipped behind the clouds, and light rain began to mist the windows. Even the weather seemed to be trying to set the mood. I stepped into the living room again. The hole in the wall hadn't disappeared. It was still there, as dark and unknowable as ever. "Grandpa, are you there? Can you hear me?" I asked, my voice shaky. No one responded. I turned on my phone's flashlight and approached. I needed to look. I was afraid, yes, but curiosity pushed me forward. "All right," I told myself, on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. I aimed the light into the gap and looked through. Staring back at me was a wrinkled face, not my grandfather's, but an unfamiliar elderly woman in a black headscarf. Her skin was ghostly pale, almost corpse-like, though maybe she was death for all I knew. Her sharp, yellowed fingernails suddenly shot toward me, aimed at my eyes. I jerked back just in time, ducking behind the wall. "Hide those shameless eyes," growled a raspy voice. Then another voice joined in, hoarse, but unmistakably familiar. "Leave him be. That's my grandson." My legs gave out and I slid down the wall, weak with shock. My dead grandfather was standing up for me against that terrifying old woman. "Why'd you open that hole?" she snapped. "He asked me to," my grandfather replied. Then both of them fell silent. Summoning every bit of courage, I managed to ask, "Grandpa Vova, is that really you? Tell me, what's it like over there?" And he answered, "Don't be in a rush to find out, Dimka. There's nothing here, no light, just empty rooms and cobwebs in the corners, a place full of lifeless sorrow." When I lifted my eyes to the wall again, the hole had vanished. Not a trace remained. Even the wallpaper looked untouched, perfectly smooth. But his words stayed with me, burned into memory. Where had my grandfather ended up? He spent his life in isolation, and now it seemed he was trapped in the same way, after death in cold, vacant spaces full of dust and silence. Was this his punishment? Or is that what waits for all of us in the end?